Some would argue that Al-Qaeda represents Islam, true Islam. In fact, that's what Al-Qaeda would argue. Others would argue that Al-Qaeda has nothing to do with Islam. I would argue that neither is really accurate, and instead that Al-Qaeda straddles the periphery of Islam, with one foot inside and one foot outside of the Ummah. Al-Qaeda relies heavily on certain medieval interpretations of Sunni Islam, specifically a maximalist interpretation of monotheism, or the oneness of God, referred to as Tawheed, and on what many would agree are literal interpretations of the Quran and a strict emulation of the life of the Prophet Muhammad, referred to as Taqlid. By relying on Tawheed and Taqlid, Al-Qaeda cloaks itself firmly in the elements of Sunni orthodoxy. However, Al-Qaeda quickly departs from this orthodoxy by violently excommunicating those Muslims who do not agree with its interpretation of Islam. So this concept is known as takfir, to declare a Muslim to be an infidel, a non-believer. This is really the basis of the argument that Ibn Taymiyyah was making when he advocated for the revolutionary overthrow of the nominal Muslim leaders in his day. Because they weren't true Muslims, they could be violently overthrown. He was in effect excommunicating these leaders from the faith. This is a sin, according to Sunni Islam. It's really the second greatest sin, next to idolatry in Sunni Islam, because it sows tremendous fitna, or discord within the community. You can imagine if one member of the community can excommunicate the other based on their interpretation of what right and wrong is, as opposed to leaving these matters for God to decide, how problematic that is if you're trying to create, lead, and grow a faith community. So this reliance on takfir is really a sin and sets Al-Qaeda outside of the fold. So given this positioning of Al-Qaeda right on the periphery, half in and half outside of the Islamic sphere, what else do we need to know about how Al-Qaeda sits theologically relative to other actors in the Muslim world? Well, Al-Qaeda is a small group. It always has been a small group. We often measure it in the hundreds of members. Okay, this is not a mass movement, but yet it situates itself amongst other violent actors. Okay? And it, in effect, tries to reorient the violence, the nature of the violence, and the purpose of the violence of these other militant groups. And we'll explain that more going forward. But in general, it tries to do this to create a fundamentalist interpretation of Sunni Islam as the political law of the land and the places in which it operates. When I say fundamentalist, this takes different forms in different geographic locations. And so in the Arab Middle East, we refer to Salafi interpretations of Sunni Islam. This again is a reference to the pious predecessors, the early generations of Muslims who learned about Islam directly from the Prophet Muhammad and his successors. So a Salafi interpretation of Islam stands in contrast to more traditional forms of Sunni Islam, which have evolved over the 1400 years since the start of the faith. These four traditional schools are often referred to as mainstream, and they are sort of further complicated by more progressive interpretations of Islam. Sunni Islam is a highly decentralized faith. There is not one pope or pope equivalent. There's nothing like the papacy indicating what is the right interpretation. And so you have tremendous variation across the Sunni world, which really represents 85% of the Muslim community. So about 1.2 billion people from Southeast Asia, across North Africa, South Asia, the Middle East. You can imagine the amount of diversity. Well, fundamentalist interpretations seek to sort of strip away that diverse set of interpretations that have evolved over time and space, and replace it with a more literal interpretation. In South Asia, we often talk about Deobandi Islam as a more fundamentalist interpretation. Now, fundamentalist doesn't imply violence, and it doesn't imply the kind of extremism that we saw even in the case of groups like the Taliban's interpretation. Those are fairly anomalous, but Al-Qaeda is trying to situate or reorient the violence of militant groups to establish that kind of a fundamentalist interpretation at the expense of more traditional forms of Sunni Islam in the Muslim world as the organizing principle of society. And again, there's that term, or there's the term Islamism that I've used. Islamism is an important term for us to understand, and we're going to explain it a little bit further. But when I use the term in this lecture, I mean it to represent a modern political ideology which asserts that Islam should be the primary source of governance in a political community. So when we really unpack this, Al-Qaeda is a violent, fundamentalist, Islamist Sunni group that ensconces itself in Islamic vocabulary and rhetoric, but frequently acts outside of Islam.